I've got my PowerPoint up now, and you see the title there is indicated. This is German currency through the eyes of the Allied armies. And I'm going to start off here with noting my sources, which is usually reserved for the end of a presentation, but the sources here are more important, or what I really wanted to focus on here. The documents that you're going to see are all part of the records from the Office of Military Government of the United States to the Foreign Exchange Depository Group. And the beautiful thing about them is that they're all available online. And I'm going to click to them so that you can see. And they're all available online for free on the site fold3.com, which is an ancestry-run site that is dedicated to military records. The records themselves appear within what's referred to as their Holocaust collection. And the reason for that is in the 1990s, President Clinton ordered the National Archives to digitize all of the records that the National Archives had that related to recovery of Holocaust assets. And the Omnibus Foreign Exchange Depository Group was in charge of the among other things, looted items that had come into possession of the military government. But when they digitized their records, they simply digitized everything they had. So a lot of the records that they digitized had nothing to do with the Holocaust assets, and thankfully for us, they have everything to do with our currency. And they say these are free. There's thousands of records out there. What you're going to hear, most of it is not anything that's new. But I just thought that the perspective coming from the Allied side, or from the Army side, as we were advancing towards Germany, at some point the U.S. Treasury had, and I apologize for those of you who are on a phone, you may not be able to see this very well because it is designed to be projected. But anyway, in 1943, the U.S. Treasury did a survey to determine what the currency situation in Germany was. And the information that they presented was not very thorough. And the main reason for that is in the early 1930s, the Germans had made the mark inconvertible and made it illegal to carry Reichsmarks out of the country, to the extent that they had all kinds of instruments to carry that out. Those of you who are the military or German collectors are familiar, or should be familiar, with the ship's money orders. And what this was essentially the currency that was used on board German cruise ships. You couldn't bring, if you were a German going on to a cruise for the Hamburg America line in the United States, you couldn't bring your Reichsmarks onto the boat. You exchanged them for money orders that you used on the ship. And then when you came back, you exchanged them back for your Reichsmarks. At some point in October of 1944, as the Allies are moving themselves closer and closer towards Germany, in these documents of the Foreign Exchange Depository Group, there's a letter, communique from the 3rd Infantry Division, American Army Division, up to what at that point was the currency section for SHAEF, the Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Forces, saying, we expect that to be in Germany soon, and it would be a good idea for us to be able to tell our soldiers what to expect from German currency when we get there. And the initial response from SHAEF's currency section was, we'll let you know when we find out, because they were just as in the dark as the as everybody else was about what the currency situation was. Now, on the slide that you see here is a document that the currency section put out in February of 1945 that summarized what they knew at that point about the German currency in circulation. And it's for the most part accurate. There is a lot of correspondence going back and forth between echelons in finance offices saying, you've got this date wrong. No, that doesn't comport with this information. The bank, they asked the Bank of England, and the Bank of England said, well, our information is only current as of 1942. So they sort of had to divine this as they went along. I'm not sure if they thought to ask prisoners of war or anybody else like that in the lower echelon of Germans they may have captured. But they're almost scrambling in the dark trying to find out the information. They spoke to representatives of the banks in Belgium and the Netherlands, and they said the same thing. We don't know. We've been across the channel as long as you've been across the channel, and all we know is that as German soldiers came here, they didn't come here with Reichsmarks. They came with their occupation currency. So we don't know what's used internally in Germany. Eventually, it's the Bank of France that comes to the rescue, and we'll see that momentarily. But the part of the confusion in all of this is that there are various types of German currency that are out there. The military currency is there. The domestic currency is there. Of course, if you can read the document here below, it refers to what currency is invalid and talks about the notes that are issued prior to August 30th, 1924, the mark notes, notes issued by private banks, and then notes issued by the Rentenmark notes. And at some point in the correspondence where they're trying to figure out what notes are valid, someone says, you really need to be telling people what notes are not valid also, because we know that there's lots of invalid or obsolete notes out there. Even when they do get information, it is sometimes an error, even some of the information that they would get from Germans. Now, talk a little bit about the Reich Bank here. As the Allied forces made their way into Germany and they came and they entered into a German town that had been cleared of active military operations, some of the first people that entered there were the civil affairs units and the finance units. And that was particularly the case if there was a Reichsbank branch located there. Oftentimes they were greeted at the door of the branch of the Reichsbank by the bank director with the keys, who was more than willing to hand them over to the Allied forces that were coming in, because that meant that he had fulfilled his mission of securing the assets of the bank and making sure that they were safe, and then he turned them over to the military authorities. He was no longer going to be responsible. Another aspect of the Reichsbank is that the Reichsbank was fiercely independent, and its loyalty was to the German economy. Particularly in the 1930s, you see there are disagreements between Reichsbank officials and the political government officials about economic policy. And while Reichsbank officials were required to be party members, they were party members in the same way that people like Oskar Schindler were party members. They had to because of the positions that they were, but they were scarcely Nazis. Um, the the officers get bits and pieces of information. There is confusion between what's a Rentenmark and what's a Reichsmark. What does Renten mean? Why were these? Why are there so many different currencies? They couldn't figure out the dates. At one point, the Bank of England had said, well, there was a new German 5-mark note that was issued, dated 1943. No, it's 1942. And we really need to get this information straight, so that our folks don't get taken advantage of when they get into Germany, because it had already been determined, at least for the Western Allies, that the American troops, the Western troops, were going to be paid in Allied military marks, and that they would be able to engage in trade with the locals, and what they're going to get back in change. They're not going to get Allied military marks back in change. They're going to get Reichsmarks back, and they need to know what they're looking at to make sure that they don't get taken advantage of. And again, it indicated there was confusion about Rentenmark versus Reichsmark. At one point, the Bank of England is indicating that there are 1 and 2 Reichsmark notes that have been issued, and that's incorrect. The 1 and 2 mark notes were Rentenmarks, but they were remain valid. The Bank of England also was unaware of the 1,000 Reichsmark note that was issued in 1936, which was the title slide, and we'll see again. But the important thing is they're wanting to get this all right so that it can trickle down to the lower echelons. Now, having been an enlisted man in the Army, I can only imagine how this information was relayed to them down through the channels. I'm picturing a band of brothers sitting on a riverbank, and somebody saying, "Hey, we got this note. Pay attention to the money that you get," and not really going into a whole lot of details with them about it. Here's the 1,000 Reichsmark again. The document is again identifying the differences between Rentenmarks and Reichsmarks. There's confusion about the dates that are on there, because the notes all have an authorization date and an issue date, and what date, when we put this information out, which date do we want to use for our passing down to the troops. And they finally, going back to that first slide, said, okay, here's what we're going to tell them as far as what notes are still valid. And here, as I said, they were able to turn to the French for some assistance. There's lots of correspondence asking for examples of German currency, and the response back is, we don't have any, we don't have any, we don't have any. Finally, the Bank of France says, oh, we have some information we can provide. And the Bank of France printed up the information sheet that you see on the right side of the screen. They had made an inquiry to the German military authorities in France in 1943 to ask them what if they could provide examples of what the German domestic currency looked like, and they were given pictures of the notes that you see here. They then put together this tablet or chart depicting the notes, and as you see, the They printed off 50 copies of this with the intention of distributing it to civil affairs and the finance offices. And then they got repeated requests for additional copies, and all that they made were 70 copies of it. But now they finally have examples of what the notes look like. Now, to further confuse things, they begin in January of 1945 to get, they're getting radio messages, news broadcasts out of Germany that indicate that the Reichsbank is going to be issuing newer notes that look different than look the same, but have some different characteristics. So they need to pin this down so that they have an understanding of what these notes look like also. And the first information that they get are coming out, you see it's going to be in a simplified form, 10 and 20 mark notes, and I'm reading from the document that's attached here. As the bank notes will have no watermarks and will otherwise be more simply executed. Okay. The 10 mark note there is one of the new, the more simply executed notes that they're talking about. The significant differences on the face, I don't know if you can see the cursor. There, in the previous notes, there was a series letter that was in this location, and then an embossed stamp over here next to the counter. Those are gone from this note. On the back, the serial numbers, the original notes had serial numbers on the face and back. The serial numbers are no longer printed on the back. Additional news reports come out. Again, these are German reports regarding the new notes, and this time they coming from the same sources that previous indication or previous report indicated that there would be no watermarks on those notes. Well, that's not true. They're just different watermarks. The watermarks on the original notes were the same, or the portraits of the that are shown on the note itself. The new watermarks are all changed to design, and each one of them is, each denomination is different. Up here explains what they are. This is the previous issue 10 mark note. You see the letter E down below. It probably doesn't come out, but the embossed seal is located here. There's a little bit of analysis on the bottom here, which suggests that, oh, by simplified, they're going to lithograph them instead of plate printing, that the paper is going to be different. What it really came down to was that the production facilities at the Reichsbürgerie in Berlin had been destroyed. They had farmed out production around the country, and yes, they needed to simplify the process in order to continue to issue the amount of notes that they needed. And this is the original 20 mark note, along with a report that talks about a new type of 20 mark note that was found. And it goes through and describes it, and it's based, they're looking at the reports that we just saw about the change in the watermark, the lack of the letter, and so forth. And they're saying, well, this doesn't make sense because this one has a letter W. It still has a watermark of a face on it. And what they eventually discover is it's an entirely new note, which is the 20 Reichsmark note that is shown here. The history of that note is that it was originally printed in 1939, but then not released. And as the indication was, it wasn't released because of quality control problems. and but they maintained the stock. As the war went on and the currency needs became greater, and the production facilities, the production chain was damaged by the war. They needed more notes, so they put these into storage. The note indicates that they had just arrived at the Reichsbank in Kaiserslautern shortly before the Allies showed up in Kaiserslautern. That the notes were still in their packaging, and even the officers at the Reichsbank in Kaiserslautern looked at them as sort of a novelty, is the term that they used. They hadn't issued any out, and they weren't sure what to do with them, if because of the swastika that appears so prominently in the middle, and you saw that previously on the 100, and I'll talk about that later. But that further adds to the confusion, because what we thought, or what they were getting reports of a certain type of new issue of 20 mark note, now they've run into a different type of 20 mark note, and they're really, as I said before, sort of scrambling to find out what is the truth here. In addition to the current notes, of course, as I said earlier, there are thousands and thousands of obsolete notes that are still in Germany, and they want to caution that they not be taken advantage of by taking them in. In the records, there are examples of, on 2 occasions, of finance officers, American finance officers, that took in obsolete German notes. Thankfully for them, what they took in were 10 mark and 20 mark notes. They were ultimately determined to be personally responsible because they had been trained not to take them, and yet they did. And the official exchange rate was 10 Reichsmarks to $1. So that mistake only cost them $1 or $2. Thankfully, they weren't taking in a 10,000 or 100,000 or a million mark note from the inflation era. Curiously, the document that's on the left of this slide, it says certain information about Germany has already been supplied to cashiers and allied paymasters. It has assumed that civil affairs officers had already received adequate instruction. It appears, however, that some civil affairs officers, even finance officers, have forgotten that there was a financial collapse in Germany in the 20s. Experience in this area, that there are still a lot of pre-1924 notes about, and it seems essential that all military government officers should be given some instruction so that they may be on their guard not to accept them. As indicated, obviously, some people didn't get that message or weren't paying attention. I think they can probably be forgiven to have forgotten it, as most of your civil affairs officers and so forth were probably in their mid-20s and were infants at the time that this of the German hyperinflation. But these, again, just further contribute to the sort of chaos that you'd be entering into from the outside, not having any good information about what the German currency situation was. Then on top of that, there are unfinished notes. And this is a report coming out of Berlin in August of 1945. Incidentally, all of the notes pictured, the documents come from the records. All of the notes pictured are notes from my collection. They of unfinished notes that are entering into the marketplace, and that we need to be aware of them. The note pictured in the slide is an unfinished 20 mark. If you recall the image previously, it's missing the final color prints on it. And there are So again, note that this is from August of 1945. This next one is a report from November of 1945, and that these continue to be a problem, and that they're continuing to appear on the economy. Curiously, and I'm going to go back, this communique towards the bottom indicates that counterfeiting groups are now engaged in reproducing this unsigned currency. I don't know how true that is. I suspect that they were probably more inclined to try to be finishing the notes than trying to reproduce notes that obviously are not, were not fully printed and not valid. The other interesting thing on this slide, on the document that's attached, the note written on the bottom, the handwritten note, is from Lieutenant Colonel Cragen, who was with the Schaeff Finance Office. And he writes the check with the director of the Reichsbank in Frankfurt on 3 December 46. It's fully a year after the memorandum, the date of the memorandum here, which incidentally comes from a U.S. Secret Service agent. Sometime in mid-1945, the currency section asks higher echelon to ask the Schaeff office if they could get the Treasury Department to send Secret Service agents over because they've uncovered a counterfeiting scheme. That counterfeiting scheme was Operation Bernhard, and within the foreign exchange depository records on Fold 3 are some rather extensive reports and interviews with people involved in the Operation Bernhard. There's also a fascinating report, and I suspect Joe Bowling, among others, would be interested in this, of an investigation into the printing capabilities of within the Western zones in Germany. They do an inventory of where the presses are, where the plates are, and what it's going to take to get them back up to speed to be able to print Reichsmarks again. The Western Allies wanted very badly for the Germans to be able to print Reichsmarks to supply the currency needs. The Russians were not in favor of that, and so it never did come to fruition. As the Reichsbank offices, as their currency supplies dwindled, because no new notes were being made, they were forced to ask the Allied military government for Allied military marks, which they were then given to issue out in place of Reichsmarks because there were because of the lack of Reichsmarks available. At one point, the lower echelons asked the foreign exchange depository whether they could access the Reichsmarks that were found in the Merkers mine. There's somewhere on the order of 20 to 25 million in Reichsmarks that were found in the Merkers mine, and the military government wanted to be able to use those to supply to the Reichsbanks for circulation, and ultimately they were turned down. There's no explanation given as to why they couldn't be used, but they weren't. So the Reichsbanks were forced to pay to ask the Allied military government for Allied military marks to circulate. So the unfinished notes are a problem also. Then there's the military notes. The Reichskreditkassen, the government credit office, was the issuing authority for the German occupation money that was used outside of Germany, and it was used for the Wehrmacht troops were paid in RKT notes, and it's what was used to acquisition property. The Germans established exchange rates against the RKT marks that were very favorable to the Germans, and clearing of those notes had to be done back through Germany, but they themselves were not valid within Germany. So the Reichsmark notes were not valid outside of Germany, and the Reichskredit Kostenschein notes note, which is the Verrechnungsschein that you see pictured here, that those were to be clearing notes. And all that they essentially served as is if you were traveling outside of Germany back to Germany, you turned in your RKT notes for the Verrechnungsschein. When you got into Germany, then you used these to turn back into Reichsmarks. So it's just another way of keeping the two currencies separate. Now, one of the as German troops fall back, as the Allies are pinching them from the east and west, when they get back into Germany itself, they stop being paid in the RKT notes, and they again are being paid in Reichsmarks from the Reichsbank. And this, the commentary in the bottom of this document suggests that that's one of the reasons why the stocks of Reichsbank notes has been dwindling, is because now all of a sudden they're paying out large amounts to the German military that they hadn't been responsible previously. One of the dangers of the Verrechnungsschein, and here's the 50 mark from the Reichskreditkassen, the government credit office, is that those notes are denominated in Reichsmarks, just as the Reichsbank notes are. And since they were not valid within Germany itself, the Allies wanted to make sure that their forces and their troops did not take them in, because if they did, they would be valueless. To further add to that confusion, the Reichsbank in Schleswig, when it ran out of Reichsmarks, had a supply of RKT notes, which they had been using for Denmark, with German troops in Denmark. And when they ran shy of their Reichsmark notes, they overstamped the RKT notes and made them legal tender within Germany. Now, Schleswig was in the British zone. When the British found this out, they asked up above, saying, what should we do about this, if anything? And they were told, you need to put a stop to it as soon as you can, because that's just going to further confuse things. Now, I know that Joe Bowling earlier had talked about the Warrington Faker. Thankfully, the Warrington Faker has not discovered the overstamp that they used on the RKT notes, and hopefully he never does. They are quite scarce when you can find them in the marketplace. As the document here, the note shown is the 20 Reichsmark from the government credit office, and the document is from the Reichsbank itself, asking the Allied military government to rethink its stance on not honoring the RKT notes. And they put forth a rather compelling argument, and that is when these German soldiers received these notes when they were outside of Germany, they were told that they would have value. It wasn't their fault that as they fell back, they weren't able to exchange them. And in many cases, it was the only money that they had on their hands. And this is as late as August of 1945, where they're making this request. The request itself fell on deaf ears, and they did not honor the RKT notes. Specimens. As collectors, we're all excited about specimens. Lots of correspondence about wanting to get examples and creating specimen sets. And eventually the authorization came down and said you can make specimens out of the notes that you have by overprinting them or perforating them, however you want to do it. But if you do so, you're not going to demonetize them. And when you're done with those, just put them back in your currency stocks and issue them out as regular notes. I have not encountered any specimens that may have been created in that way. And given, again, the proliferation of rubber stamps at this point, I would be suspicious of any that would come on the market at this point. But they did create, compile 50 some odd sets of specimen Allied military marks and then specimen German notes that they sent out to the finance offices so that they had, again, examples of them. But then the instructions were that they were to not, the Reichsmark notes were to just be dispersed out with their, like any other note, even though that they were marked as specimens. Talked earlier about the swastika. The swastika appears very prominently on the 1,000 mark, the 100 mark, and on the newer 20 mark note. The document that's attached is a report of a intercepted radio broadcast from Germany itself, complaining about, and this is a quote, the thousands of rotters who are running to the banks and savings banks today to change the 100 Reichsmark notes with swastikas printed on them. And then it identifies the type of notes that we're talking about, the 100 mark here and the new 20 mark note. And then it says, evidently the rotters of the Ruhr had heard of the military government's invalidation of tainted postage stamps. And what that's referring to is when the Allied military government was established and when they, in the areas that they occupied, they invalidated, they brought in postage stamps for use by the Allied, by the military government, and that were to be used by the civilians as well, and invalidated the German postage stamps, most of which featured the portrait of Adolf Hitler. The notes didn't suffer the same fate. They never did demonetize the 100 mark or the 20 mark, and they remain valid up until the currency reform in 1948. If you collect notes from that series, you'll note that they appear with the Russian stamps for the Russian currency reform. But there was some concern, given the fact that they just made all of their postage stamps invalid, that they were going to do the same as part of the denazification process. But they were, for various reasons, not the least of which is, again, a problem with the supply of notes. The notes were not demonetized and continued to be used. Additional confusion comes from the creation of local currency. As most of us know, in the 1920s, during the inflationary period and after the First World War, there's pretty much the heyday of local currency being produced in Germany, and it happened again in 1945 as areas were cut off from the supply of notes from the Reichsbank. And the Allied military government were very quick to put a stop to the production of locally made notes. There are pages and pages of reports of the locally printed notes. I just have one page here. They're very detailed at times. This particular page talks about the 1,220,000 that was printed in Norden, of which they issued 700,000 marks before it was put a stop to. Discusses notes 50 million marks that were intended to be printed in Hamburg, but the Allies got there before before they could be issued. And then the note pictured is from the community of Heidenheim. It has an interesting history in that this version of it is dated 25 April 45. You can see the swastika on the underprint, and on the back side has a German soldier. They denazified that note and issued a revised version in May of 45 that did not have the swastika, and the German soldier on the back was replaced with a farmer. They ran afoul of the military government because they changed the legend here, which said that it was issued by the authority of the Interior Ministry of Württemberg, to say that it was issued under the authority of the military government. When this got up to the upper echelons, they shot back to the local military government people in the area and said, "What are you doing approving these notes?" And they said, "We have no idea what you're talking about." Ultimately, all of the locally produced notes were withdrawn. Locally produced notes, this type was produced through the Reichsbank in the Sudetenland. The accompanying note, this comes from 21st Army Group, which was a British, were in charge of that, identifying this type of note having been found. The image on the right, this is the only one that's not from my collection because this image is from the documents themselves. I do have an example of it. And ultimately, they conclude that this is a problem for the Czechs, as by this time, this portion had been returned or had been taken out of control of the Allied military government in Germany, and was being turned over to the occupation authorities in Czechoslovakia. How they were honored or whether they were honored, there's no indication. They just washed their hands of it. And then we have the Salzburg, what I refer to as the Salzburg marks. This is my favorite series, just because of the way that they're discovered from the military government standpoint. The letter that's attached here is from 5 June of 45, and it's a request up to the financial branch at SHAEF saying, please tell us about this 50 mark note. This 50 Reichsmark note, somebody tried to pay a court fine, soldier, particularly a German soldier, tried to pay a court fine with this 50 mark note. And he says that he got it from the Reichsbank in Salzburg. Please tell us whether it's valid or not. The initial reports that are kicked around up in the currency section are, we'll look at it. It's obviously fake. It's not even close. It's printed poorly. The text that's over where the watermark was doesn't belong there. This is all wrong. Well, additional reports begin to come in, and they realize, well, these things all have the same serial number. What is happening here? These have to be counterfeits again because they're so poorly done, and it wouldn't make any sense that anybody would do this. There's a kind of a comical story if you read the reports of two sisters. They're older teens, and they were members of an anti-aircraft battery. And they come home with their pay and bring it to their mother, and it's in these notes. And their mother says, why on earth would you accept these? They're obviously bad. And they said, no, we got them from the paymaster. They've got to be good. In a few days, the Allies overrun this area, and the mother takes the two girls to the Allied military, to the Allied military authorities, and say, hey, my daughter's got paid in this counterfeit money. Please do something about this. And the daughters are insisting, no, it's not counterfeit. We got it from the paymaster. They try to hunt down the paymaster. He's already taken prisoner of war, and they can't find him. But in the meantime, they're getting additional reports of these notes are appearing as far away as Britain and Belgium in the hands of displaced persons and POWs. And we're getting, all right, we need to find out what's going on here. So they send a team down. Everything centers on Salzburg. They send a team down to Salzburg, where they meet with the directors of the Reichsbank, and they said, oh yeah, we printed these. We had them printed. We had authority. There was a secret communique from 1939 that said if you're ever in trouble and you're separated from the supply, you can go ahead and print notes on our authority. Given that information, the Allies said, all right, since these were issued by the Reichsbank, we're going to have to honor them, but we want them all withdrawn. They published a notice in the newspaper that said that after the 31st of August, they would no longer be valid, and you had until then to turn them into the Reichsbank office and exchange them for current notes. The 10 Reichsmark note there that's pictured here, I acquired that note from a coin dealer when I was in Augusta, Georgia, 20 some odd years ago. I was going through his junk box and picked out a few things, and that note was in there. And he didn't have anything priced, and he was going through them, and he just sort of looked at that one. He says, you know, that's a copy, right? And I said, well, yeah. And he says, yeah, I don't feel right charging you for that one, which I was more than happy to get for free. But that, again, just shows the total confusion that was going on when they finally do straighten this out to say almost all of the notes end up being recalled. Here's the 100 mark, as well as the example of a communique that they were sending out so that they could be identified. This is not the final version of the communique. The reason that I chose this version, though, they say this is from June of '45, is if you notice, whoever drafted it originally identified them as mark notes, and then someone who's editing it crossed them off and put in the notation, the abbreviation for Reichsmark. And the reason I show that is that it shows that even within the finance circles on the U.S. side of people who should know better, they were also confusing marks with Reichsmarks. And it didn't help that Allied military marks were denominated as marks and not as Reichsmarks. Last couple of things before I get to questions here. Talked about things about your enemies, and here are notes among your friends. There's lots of correspondence about Allied military marks in these documents. This one, they get bits and pieces from the Russians about the Russian printed notes. The communique indicates that, look, we're going to have an overlap in serial numbers on some of these things. As it turns out, they're really the only overlap when you take the dashes into consideration. On Russian notes would be on the 1 mark. You could do an entire day program on the lack of communication with the Russians and theirs. There's lots of letters asking the Russians for how many notes have you produced, how many have you issued, and they get absolutely no reply. I included this correspondence because it has to do with an error. The serial numbers didn't match. And this came up from a finance page asking, what do we do about this? Can you tell us whether it's whether it's valid or not, or whether this is a counterfeit. They ultimately conclude, and it's not the note that's pictured. I'm just picturing a 100-mark note. They ultimately conclude that it's valid, that this is an error. But then when it gets higher up, they say, yeah, this should really be brought to the control council for exchange, so that you can get a good note, not one with this bad serial number on it. Good luck with that. As I said, the Russians were not very cooperative with the financial authorities on matters regarding the printing and issuing of the Russian Allied military marks, and never did get the answers that they were looking for. And I believe that concludes my presentation.